Today we're going to be talking about the Civil War, the war between the states. Really the most divisive, but the most important war as far as the United States is concerned. It's really a war over the soul of America and over this debate of slavery and racism and human rights and how we are as a nation going to proceed from this moment forward. Okay? So we're going to start off with strengths and weaknesses of the North and the South. Okay? Who has the military advantage going into this war? The North has 3/4 of the U.S.'s Navy officers. Nearly all of its sailors were New Englanders. So definite naval advantage. Nearly all the United States Navy warship were also stationed in the North, not seized by the South during secession. All but one major shipyard was in the North. So as far as the Navy is concerned, the North definitely has an advantage. Okay, in the South, a third of the Navy, the Army's officers resigned to join the Confederacy, including Robert E. Lee, who was known to be the most brilliant military officer coming out of West Point. Okay, 7 of 8 military colleagues were in the United States. Colleges in the United States were in the South, so there were many more trained soldiers in the South. So you've got training programs in the South, and this is still the case. There are still a number of training programs in the South. I actually was trained when I was in the military at Fort Benning, Georgia. Okay, let's look at some of these leaders. Robert E. Lee, 1807 to 1870, high-ranking U.S. officer in the Army at the start of the war, was offered command of the Union soldiers because he was the foremost general at the time, and he opposed secession and abhorred slavery, but he was very loyal to Virginia, and he resigns from the U.S. Army and instead takes command of the Confederate soldiers. Okay, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, Lee's top officer. He is a Confederate. He's a brilliant military strategist, as was Lee, and he is accidentally shot by the Confederate forces, lost his arm. This type of thing was not difficult to have happen. You're still using, gunpowder that smoked, and so the battlefield was a very, very chaotic, smoky place during this time period. A lot of people close together, etc. Lee on Jackson says that Jackson has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right. And so Stonewall Jackson, as he's called, is Lee's right-hand man. Dies 8 days later from pneumonia after he gets shot. Okay, Jeb Stuart. Okay, Lee's commander of cavalry. Sorry, speaking is hard today. Present at many major battles of the war, showed he liked to take on daring attacks without permission. One of these forays left Lee's forces unprotected at Gettysburg. So, in war, oftentimes there's risk versus reward, and sometimes you make a bold move and it turns out well, and you've deviated from the plan, but it all works out. However, this type of action is also very risky, and is one of the reasons why the Confederates lost so many soldiers at Gettysburg. He's killed in action in 1864. Okay, George McClellan, placed in command of the Union forces twice by Lincoln, but fired both times because his cautiousness and unwilling to attack if the situation wasn't perfect. He was always looking for the perfect situation that would cause the least amount of casualties. But one of the primary tenets of warfare is aggression and keeping the opponent on their heels. And there's never going to be an absolute perfect battlefield to fight on. I mean, guys like Napoleon were very good at baiting his enemies into fighting on ground ground that was favorable to him, but he still marched quickly and attacked swiftly whenever possible. And McClellan ended up running as a Democrat for president against Lincoln in 1864. Lincoln is a Republican. Okay, and that was covered during the last video. Ulysses S. Grant, disgraced and run out of the army before the war, returned to his duty and was highly successful in Western campaigns, eventually made overall United States commander. He takes control of the United States forces and ends up leading the Union to victory. And he later becomes the President of the United States. Okay, William Tecumseh Sherman is a notorious character and practiced what is called scorched earth policy in his March to the Sea campaign, damaging the South. So what he did was he was a Union commander who slashed and burned farms and plantations and destroyed much of not only the infrastructure, but in entire swaths of land, burning crops, burning homes, etc. And one of the major parts of the Reconstructive era was trying to rebuild from the damage that he and people like him had done. He captures Raleigh, North Carolina near the end of the war. He's quoted saying, war is hell, but he created hell on earth in a lot of places that he went. After the war, he assumes command of the Indian Wars in the Great Plains. He was a brutal individual who was absolutely ruthless in the tactics that he employed. Okay, so let's look at who has the manpower advantage in this. The North has a population of like 22 million, about. More population meant there were enough men to fight and work in industry and farming. Additionally, immigrants from Europe all came into the northern ports. And they also had a better relationship with the Europeans, but we'll get back to that. In the South, they only had a population of 9 million, 3 million of which were slaves. So a population that they're going to allow to fight, the pool that they're drawing from is 6 million. So 6 million as opposed to 22. It's a huge difference. Less population meant that nearly every able-bodied white man would have to fight, would have to contribute to the war effort through farming, managing slaves, etc. Manufacturing. Now, the North has 80% of the U.S. factories, 90% of clothes, shoes, iron, etc. made in the North. The economy in the South was predominantly agricultural and functioned on producing raw goods. Nearly 100% of the guns and gunpowder are also made in the North, and so the North had a huge advantage as far as supplies are concerned and weapons for their soldiers. The South only had one ironworks which could make proper cannons, no gunpowder manufacturing. They did move quickly to build factories to make weapons and gunpowder, but still relied on Europe for many other goods. And one of the key tenets that we'll talk about a little bit is cutting the South off from trade. Okay, rifles. When the war started, the majority of people are using sorry, you can hear my dog flapping her ears. When the war starts, they're using muzzle loaders predominantly, but with round balls that are very inaccurate. And as the war progresses, they start making conical shaped bullets that travel much straighter down through rifling out the barrel. They're much more accurate. I cannot find it, but I actually have a bullet from Gettysburg. It's about this big. It's a 50 caliber bullet fired out of one of these guns, and you can actually see on it, its conical shape, and would be still muzzle loaded, but very different type of munition. Okay, the Monitor and the Merrimack, these two ships here, U.S. versus Confederate here, and this is the first battle between iron ships. Okay, ironclads, steam-powered ships covered in sheets of iron armor, and it is a turning point in naval warfare the world over. Naval warfare will never be the same again because these ships are so dangerous and so much better as far as protection is concerned than wooden ship counterparts. So after this moment, and through the Industrial Revolution that comes after the Civil War, it is iron ships that will, or steel ships that will be built around the world and used for naval warfare after this point. There were still wooden ships, however, this marks a turning point in naval technology. Okay, the first battle, March 9th, 1862, between the USS Monitor, okay, and the CSS Virginia, formerly the USS Merrimack. Okay. And by the way, U.S. United States, CS Confederate States. Okay. The battle was indecisive. They damaged each other so much they were inoperable after, but it changes warfare after that. And then the CSS Hunley, basically the first submarine used in warfare. Both sides developed submarine technology, but the South was the only side to put one into action. The CSS Hunley sank a northern ship blockading the Charleston Harbor. In 1864, Hunley also sinks in the attack, but you see a divergence from the way naval warfare has been done in the past to a new style of naval warfare with new technologies that are emerging in the Civil War. Okay, who has the transportation advantage? The North. They have 2/3 of the railroads, and the railroads are a lot more standardized as far as the gauges are concerned, whereas in the South it was a mishmash of all sorts of gauges. When I mean gauges, I mean like the actual width for the track. So if you have a rail car that runs on a track that is this wide, and then you have another one running on one that is double, I don't know if you can see that, or much smaller, you cannot have them transfer from one rail line to another. You can't build it like that. You actually have to physically take off the goods from one train, from one set of track, and transport them to another train with a different size gauge for that track. And it made supply lines a lot more difficult to get equipment, guns, munitions, food, etc., to troops quickly, because they had a lot of problems with that. Okay, National Road plus the Great Lakes connected canals and waterways for moving food materials around the North. So there's not only just railroads, but a number of other waterways that also help out with the North in the North in supplying troops, soldiers, etc., and keeping the economy going. South only has 1/3 of the rail lines. Only one major east-west rail line for moving food and materials around the South, and depended on the Mississippi River. So if the Mississippi River harbor, in New Orleans, is shut down, it effectively shuts down the southern economy as far as the western parts of those states are concerned. We'll come back to that. Okay, who has the financial advantage? The North already had an established treasury to print money, receive revenues from tariffs. They have banks, gold and silver fields of the West stayed in the Union. By the war's end, inflation in the North was at 80%, high, but not completely unreasonable. Whereas in the South, most Southern planters are what's called cash poor, already in debt, but they do have crops and goods that they can sell. The problem is finding people to sell to. Now, because the Southern government is just being created and tested, as they print money, the fear is, well, this money, if we don't win this war, is going to become absolutely worthless. And so they're scrambling to actually provide funds for the war, but also people are, concerned about, is my money worth anything? Is it not? And so it slows down the economy just in general. With southern ports blockaded by Union warships, this is one of the major plans of the North, is to blockade ports. The South could not rely on tariffs or trade revenue with Europe, and so they're printing paper money. It has little value, and they end up with an inflation rate of 9,000%. Okay, so 80% inflation is high in the North, absolutely, but it's not 9,000%. There's no real belief or faith in the southern currencies, and the inflation rate would skyrocket and then kind of normalize a little bit, skyrocket and normalize a little bit as the war progressed. If the South was winning, the economy was doing better. If in the South, the same thing happened in the North, but it was more outrageous in the South as far as the swing went for the economy. Okay, so the Southern strategy for winning: choose battles carefully, avoid risky encounters, wage a defensive war attrition, bleed out the North, and get them to concede and give the Southern states legitimacy, through saying, you can secede from the Union. We're not going to fight you anymore. It's a similar strategy to how the Americans were trying to win the Revolutionary War. However, this makes the war unpopular and ends up forcing them to negotiate because it's expensive. For both sides, this becomes a dangerous strategy because the longer this goes on, the more unpopular the war becomes. If necessary, pull European powers, especially Great Britain, into the war. The textile factories depended on southern cotton. So the South believed they would be able to get Great Britain on their side. What they didn't count on was that England had already banned slavery, and it was seen as immoral. And then President Lincoln passes the Emancipation Proclamation. We'll get back to that. Okay, Northern strategy for winning is the Anaconda Plan. I've hinted at this a little bit. So it's this. They're squeezing the South into being isolated and alone and not able to trade with anyone else and destroy their economy. So you're blockading port cities around. You're taking New Orleans. You're cutting off the Mississippi River and Mississippi and everything else, and squeezing the southern states. Okay, would take time, but be less costly in lives. And the North had the majority of the naval forces, so they were able to do this, and they were able to, for the most part, keep Europe out of the war. Okay, Britain and France depended on southern cotton textile mills, but were reluctant to anger the United States by recognizing the Confederates. Both decided to wait on a wait-and-see approach. The South proved itself in the battle, and European powers might show some more support eventually. And I apologize. My phone is ringing. How awkward. The Trent Affair. Now, they're heading this wait-and-see approach, especially at the beginning. November of 1861, the Confederate States sent James Madison and John Slidell to Europe via Cuba. They boarded the British ship Trent, after the U.S. Navy intercepted Trent and arrested Mason and Slidell. Now, they were on a diplomatic mission, and so arresting a diplomat is something that is seen as very unfavorable and is unacceptable as far as the Europeans are concerned. Britain protested, threatened war. Lincoln ordered the two diplomats released to ease tension. Okay, divisions in the Republican Party. Most Republicans want to see a total end to slavery, and that is one of the key tenets of the Republican Party at its founding. President Lincoln placed preserving the Union ahead of ending slavery. His most important thing was wanting to bring the country together. However, he did believe that slavery was amoral. Okay, if he could pull the country back together, he would tolerate slavery, and Lincoln is not absolutely perfect like he's often portrayed to be, but it is true that as soon as he became president, the Confederates left, and he was forced into a civil war. I apologize. Telemarketers are calling me. Divisions in the Democratic Party. War Democrats support the use of military force to restore the Union, oppose ending slavery. Okay? And then there's the Peace Democrats. So there's two sides, divisions. So the War Democrats support the use of military force to restore the Union. Peace Democrats oppose the war, wanting to see the Union restored through negotiation. And so one is advocating for war, one is advocating for talking. And they end up calling the Peace Democrats Copperheads and vilifying them in news clippings and political cartoons, like one seen here, where you have individuals who are depicted as snakes who are attacking, justice and war and these ideological visions of freedom in America. Republicans nicknamed the Peace Democrats Copperheads after the venomous snake. Okay. First Battle of Bull Run in 1861. The First Battle of Manassas. It's the first major battle in the Civil War. Union forces badly defeated just outside of Washington, D.C. The South does not press its advantage due to its disorganization. See, remember, one of the key ideas behind the Southern strategy is to win as many battles as possible when it becomes available and favorable for them to fight. And if not, they're leading mostly a defensive war. So they don't press the attack into the North as part of their strategy, because they're trying to win a war of attrition. Made it clear to the North that the war would not be quickly won. So there's a lot of people in the North think, well, we're just going to go crush these rebels and that'll be the end of it. It was not to be. However, we did do things like capture New Orleans. U.S. Navy under David, I cannot pronounce this, Fargo, I believe, attacked and captured New Orleans, port vital to the South, because it's where the mouth of the Mississippi River is and one of the major trade routes for the South to get goods out and in for international trade. Okay, the draft. The United States passed a militia law which required states to use conscription or the draft if necessary to field enough soldiers. Hurt the poor because the rich could buy out of the draft. For example, you'd use $300 or hire a proxy substitute to serve for them. And the draft has often been seen like this and depicted like this through American history, that the rich get out of military service while the poor have to go fight the wars for the rich, essentially. Okay? Opposed by Democrats, led to riots in strongly Democratic districts. Excuse me. CSA, Confederate States, would also use conscription to force men into service. Lincoln suspends habeas corpus. Okay. Right to trial. After habeas corpus is the right to a trial. After anti-conscription riots, Lincoln suspends the requirement that a person should not be imprisoned without being charged and given a trial. Anyone who aided the South or resisted the draft could be imprisoned indefinitely without a trial. So, like life in prison if you were accused of aiding the South. Lincoln was heavily criticized over this because habeas corpus, the right to trial and to be charged and go before a jury of your peers, is one of the core tenets of America, and is one of the reasons in the Declaration of Independence that we rebelled against England. And it goes back to English common law, where in England this was a right that had existed, for hundreds of years. So what Lincoln is doing here is wildly unpopular, not because he's trying to persecute these people who are helping the South, but because it goes against some core tenets of being an American. Legal Tender Act of 1862. Man, look at that money. It's just so different from today. Okay, as worried citizens withdrew gold and silver from U.S. banks, it creates a financial crisis, as it usually does. So as people get worried about the economy, people will go take money out of their banks, take money out of the stock market. This will hurt investment and banking and the stock market, and it tends to cause disruptions in the market, leading to a damaged economy, depression, recession, this kind of thing. So the United States created a national paper currency, which came to be known as greenbacks. Okay? Look, the back is green. Makes sense, right? Okay? So they're issuing paper money instead of like gold and silver. See, the Confederate States also began to print and use paper money. And paper money was seen as a very dangerous and risky thing because the value of your paper money fluctuated more than hard currency did and does. Grant's Western Campaign. So Ulysses Grant forces were put in charge of securing Western, mainly the West, Kentucky, Tennessee, these border states, etc. Okay, Grant won military victories, but only because he's willing to make sacrifices. So Grant is way more aggressive than his counterparts. Large numbers of Union casualties end up dying in these campaigns, as opposed to McClellan and his Peninsula campaign attempted to end the war by landing forces near Fort Monroe, Virginia, pushing up between the James New York rivers to attack Richmond, Virginia. Campaign bogged down. Lincoln ordered the return of Union forces to protect the capital. Okay, which leads to the Second Battle of Bull Run. Confederate forces defeated, but did not destroy the Union Army, opening the way for the South to invade the North. So you have the Battle of Antietam that follows this, and the Battle of Antietam holds the horrible record as the bloodiest single day in American history. September 17, 1862, Lee secretly planned to invade the North, but his plans were discovered and Union forces met at Antietam. It's the single bloodiest day of the war. Lee's defeated, but escapes south with his army still intact. So, wins the Second Battle of Bull Run. He was marching north, ends up fighting again at the Battle of Antietam, and Lee is defeated. And then Lincoln issues what is called the Emancipation Proclamation, which is one of the most important documents in American history. It's an executive order which can be overturned, so a series of constitutional amendments are required to really set this into stone afterwards, but it frees all slaves in any state which was still in armed rebellion, not in states which stayed in the Union. This encourages freed blacks to enlist the Union Army because it gives them a moral objective for fighting, to free slaves in the South. Okay, so free slaves in the South, and then as in furtherance of this, then you have amendments that are passed that free all slaves. Siege of Vicksburg. After a 2-month siege by Grant's forces, Vicksburg surrenders, giving the Union total control of the Mississippi River and permanently dividing the South. Okay? So again, so Grant was up here. He's supposed to be securing the West. He's in the West still. And he's securing Vicksburg, Mississippi, and this is, one of the centers for trade. So we're securing New Orleans, we're securing harbors, we're also securing points along the Mississippi River, trying to constrict in this Anaconda Plan. Battle of Gettysburg. Okay, the South is trying to push north again in an effort to move the war out of the South. Lee marches into Pennsylvania. He hopes to destroy public support for the war north by bringing it to their Townsend Farms. The battle is bloody, nearly 8,000 dead, 27,000 wounded. Confederate forces are defeated and turned back to Virginia. The South is not able to invade the North again and would be on defensive from this point forward. So this is the major turning point in the war, where if Lee wins the Battle of Gettysburg and starts pushing into the North, and people in the North start dying as a result of this and seeing war brought to them, the hope is that the war will become so unpopular that they'll just the treaty will be signed, essentially. But he loses, and then the North has such overwhelming supply and transportation advantages that the South can never recover enough from this defeat. The North continues to supply their troops and push them. Okay, Gettysburg Address. Again, one of the most important documents in American history. Lincoln delivered this speech 4 months after the battle at the dedication of the National Cemetery in Gettysburg. It's one of his most famous speeches, and it's only about 2 minutes long. I'm going to go ahead and read it if I can. Hopefully I don't mess it up too bad. It's essentially a eulogy. And it reads thus, the Gettysburg Address. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this, but in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to this unfinished work, which they who fought here have thus so far nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead that we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from all the earth. Yeah, it's a very, very powerful speech, essentially saying that this war is for freedom and hope for all people who are created equal. And the blood that has been shed on the ground has consecrated or set apart and made holy, essentially, by the sacrifices the men who died there gave those men who gave their lives in furtherance of this idea of freedom, and that the war must be continued in order to honor their sacrifice. It's a very, very powerful speech. Sherman's March to the Sea, mentioned this earlier. This was just awful. Okay, so he goes here through Georgia and then up through south and then into North Carolina. After capturing key railroad in the town of Atlanta, Georgia, Sherman marches his men across Georgia to the port of Savannah. And along the way, he practiced scorched earth. He's destroying everything: plantations, railroads, crop businesses, factories, etc., completely destroying the economies in this area and making it so post-war there's going to be a lot of time, money, energy, and investment, capital investment to rebuild the South, especially in areas like this. Okay, election of 1864. Democrats run George McClellan, who was the Union general and fired a couple times. Republicans ran Lincoln with with a VP candidate who was a war Democrat, Andrew Johnson. More to follow on him. He gets impeached. He's kind of a nightmare. Anyways, Lincoln won with the help of some majority Union battle victories. So he gains popularity as the Union continues to win without McClellan in the lead. And the war ends at Appomattox Courthouse, where Lee and Grant meet. Lee sees the writing on the wall and realizes that his forces cannot win this war. They do not have the troops and supplies, etc., to overcome the North and their advantages. And so, in order to lessen the amount of deaths, American deaths, he decides to sign for peace at Appomattox Courthouse. 2 weeks later, the last of the major Confederate forces surrendered in Durham. And when Lee is going to Appomattox Courthouse, he is treated with dignity and respect, and his peers really did look to him, even on the North side, as brilliant and an honorable general, etc. And he was treated very well. With this signing on April 9th, 1865, the war is over. And unfortunately, then shortly after, President Lincoln is assassinated. He is shot and killed while attending a play at Ford's Theater by a man named John Wilkes Booth, who escapes capture for 12 days. He jumps off this balcony. He's wounded. He stumbles out. He gets on a horse. He flees, but he's ended up being hunted down and killed by Union forces. Booth was an ardent Southerner who was angered by Lincoln's support of voting rights for African Americans. Okay, and thus ends the presentation on the Civil War proper. I do plan on providing a couple more videos on this topic as we move forward. Thanks very much. If you watched till the end, have a fantastic day, everyone.